And welcome everybody to the Geeking Poetic podcast channel. I'm your host, Larry Roberts, and I'm here to do another installment of my vinyl ranking series. Yes, you might have seen some of the other videos I did. Recently, I ranked some Kiss vinyl. I did their 70s studio albums as well as all of their live vinyl output, and you can check those out here. And I am going to have more Kiss output coming very soon, so if you're a Kiss fan, definitely check back on that one. A while back, I also did a ranking of the David Lee Roth Van Halen albums. That was a lot of fun, and you can check that one here as well. But today, I'm going to talk about another one of my all-time favorite rock bands. It is none other than the band Thin Lizzy. In my opinion, one of the greatest frontmen of all time, as well as one of the best voices ever in rock and roll, and also one of the most poetic and amazing songwriters that I've ever heard. I am a big fan of Thin Lizzy, so I thought it would be a lot of fun to look at their studio output and try to rank them. Let me make this really clear right now. First of all, obviously, this is just my opinion, which means nothing really to anybody but myself, but it's just a fun way for us to talk about one of my favorite bands and possibly one of your favorite bands. And I want to say that I love every one of these albums. Just like I said with the Van Halen and the Kiss videos, there isn't a bad Thin Lizzy album in existence. As we all know, Phil passed away sadly in January of 1986, and later on the band did come back with some of the former members restarting it, and they did some cool things, and I saw them. It was great. I enjoyed it. I had total respect for it. But for the purposes of this video, I'm only going to focus on what the band did while Phil was with them. And since I just got done saying that there are no bad albums in this bunch, then you might ask, how am I going to rank these? Well, this is the method that I've been using and I'm going to continue to use. I'm not looking at these as worst to best. For me, there is no worst here. They're all really good. So the way I'm ranking these is I'm looking at it like, how often do I go back and still spin these records? There are some albums, even though I really like them, I've found myself over the years not going back and playing, and certainly not playing in their entirety from beginning to end, which definitely makes this that much more hard for me, because there are some records that I know I'm not going to rank quite so high, but do happen to have a couple of my favorite Thin Lizzy songs on it. But just because it has a couple of great songs on there isn't necessarily enough to make the album as a whole rank higher than others. So yes, that's the way I'm doing this. I'm ranking them. How often do I spin them? So number one will be the album that I spin the most and all the way through with the most frequency. And then the last album will be the one that I just don't revisit as much. And let me just get this out of the way right now. I am not going to include the live albums. Now, I know a lot of people are going to have a problem with that, especially when it comes to Thin Lizzy, because let's face facts. Live and Dangerous from 1978 is an absolute stone cold classic. It's a perfect album, and frankly, just spoilers here, if I was going to include that as part of this list, it would probably be number one. But just like I did with the Kiss videos, I'm going to save the Thin Lizzy live albums for another video for another time. I feel like they deserve their own category. But yeah, Live and Dangerous, what an incredible and influential album. It's absolutely a number one, so, spoilers. So this is just my opinion, and I encourage you all, after you're done watching this, let me know your opinion. Not just about my list, but I want to hear, what is your list? What are your favorite Thin Lizzy albums, and why are they your favorites? What would be your number one? And make sure you hit that subscribe and ring that bell so that you are notified when I have more album rankings and other cool content like this coming out, because I love interacting with you. I love hearing your choices for favorites or least favorites, and I want you all to come back. Oh, and one last thing. I normally like to have my records here to show you on screen. I raced over here to the studio today and I forgot to bring my records, so I don't have them to flash on the screen. But for right now, yeah, I don't have them. I'll just make sure that the album appears on screen when I talk about it. And without any further ado, let's get into ranking the Thin Lizzy studio albums. All right, coming in last place, number 12 on my list of the Thin Lizzy studio albums that I play the most. It is their second album, 1972's Shades of a Blue Orphanage. Now, this early Thin Lizzy stuff, especially those first couple of albums, is very different from what I think most people would associate with the traditional Lizzy sound. I mean, Phil's there. His lyrics on a lot of these songs are great. You have songs like Sarah and the title track, which are beautiful songs. There's some other really cool songs on here. I like Call the Police. The Rise and Dear Demise of the Funky Nomadic Tribes is kind of a cool song with a really good drum beat to it. There's good stuff on this album. I do like it, but for whatever reason, maybe just because the vibe is so particular and so different from a lot of the Lizzy stuff that I really love, I don't revisit this album that much. I might change that in the future. It's definitely one of those mood kind of albums. I have to really be in a very specific, almost a more chill kind of mood in order to want to put on an album like Shades. Even if you're not familiar with that early Lizzy stuff, it's totally worth listening to, but it's just the one out of the whole catalog that I rarely go back and listen to anymore. So for that reason, it's number 12. All right, coming in at number 11, we have the debut album from 1971, the self-titled Thin Lizzy album. Now again, just like I was saying earlier about Shades of a Blue Orphanage, these first couple of Lizzy albums, they're definitely albums that I have to be in a very particular mood to want to hear. They're much more bluesy, folksy, rootsy sounding in a lot of ways. Eric Bell's playing on it is excellent. I can't take anything away from Eric Bell. I think he was a great guitar player. And I think songs like Remembering, Saga of the Aging Orphan, Ray Gun, those are really, really cool songs that I do go back and put on pretty often, but as a whole, I don't listen to this album that much anymore. Now, that being said, is a little bit of a caveat here. Later on, there were later versions of this album where they included bonus tracks from the New Day EP that came out the following year. And that EP had songs like Remembering Part 2, Old Moon Madness, and Things Ain't Working Out Down at the Farm, which honestly is one of my favorite Lizzy songs of all time. I love that song. It's a total jam. But it's not available on the original vinyl pressing. It's not considered one of the original tracks. So that is kind of technical here, but that's sort of what edged out Shades of a Blue Orphanage and made this number 11, because honestly, if I spin this first album, I'm usually putting on the CD. I like all those bonus tracks that are on there. And then they did the bonus tracks from the 1977 sessions where there's the more rocked up version of Things Ain't Working Out on there. Love it. I will listen to far more. But the original pressing, the original track listing for the debut album, it's just not one that I listen to all that much, even though I do think it's really good. And again, totally worth having, totally worth listening to when I'm in the right mood. All right, coming in at number 10. Now, this one might be a little bit of a surprise because I know that even though this is a sleeper album for some people, this has got its fans, and rightfully so, because I do think this is a great album. And I'm talking about 1974's Nightlife. Now, as you know, this was the first album where Thin Lizzy was joined by new guitarists Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham. And while you might have thought that that would automatically just make this band rock so much harder than they had on those first few albums, that wasn't the case. This album is actually pretty smooth. It's kind of laid back in a lot of places, which isn't a bad thing. I think songs like She Knows is great. Showdown is a great song. Sha La La is a great song. There's a bunch of really good songs on here, not least of which they have the song Still in Love with You, which actually is the one track that features Gary Moore on guitar. As a matter of fact, the CD version of this album does feature demo versions of some of these songs when Gary was actually in the band before he left, and then ultimately that's when they got Brian and Scott to play. Anyway, you might say, man, this sounds like a great record. What's wrong with you? Why would you rank this so low? Again, it's just one of those ones where it's not an automatic grab for me when I'm in a Lizzy mood. I don't find myself sitting down and listening to this whole album very often. I don't know why. All I can say is that it's another moody album from them because it's a little bit more chill. She Knows is one of my favorite Lizzy songs. Showdown's great. Still in Love with You is beautiful. But I will revisit those songs, but I don't listen to the whole album from beginning to end very often. Once in a while, I'll get in a mood, and this one would probably rank a little higher for me when I get into those moods. But being honest with myself, where it stands right now, yeah, Nightlife, it comes in at number 10 for me. Okay, coming in at number 9 on my list of most listened to Thin Lizzy albums. This one is another one. I know that a lot of people dig this album. This is one that took me a while to really get into from when I first heard it as a kid. I'm talking about 1980's Chinatown album. Now, this was their first album of the 80s. It came out, I think, in October of 1980, and it features Snowy White on guitar. Excellent guitar player. You know, I've got nothing against Snowy. I don't know that he totally gelled with the band the same way that some of the other guitar players like Brian Robertson and Gary Moore did, but I feel like his contributions on this album are decent, and there are some great songs on here. The title track, Chinatown, excellent Thin Lizzy song. It totally rips. There's a bunch of other good songs on here. Killer on the Loose is a classic. Genocide and Hey You are a couple songs I really like from this album. Again, this is another one that when I first got it as a kid, when I was like in my early teens or something like that, there was something about this album that it just didn't feel like it quite had the same organic energy that their 70s stuff before it had. It took me a while to really warm up to this album, and I gotta say now, I like this album quite a bit. I do go back and listen to this from time to time. But again, it's just one of those ones where when I look at the other albums that I'm ranking, you know, after it, I listen to those way more than this one. I will revisit this one once in a while. Like I said, there's a handful of tracks on here that I think are pretty stellar. But as a whole album, it's not one that I'm really into listening to all that frequently anymore. And yeah, let me know, how do you feel about the Snowy White albums? I know it's kind of polarizing for a lot of fans out there. I've met fans who love the Snowy White early 80s albums, and then I've met other fans who want nothing to do with it. So definitely seems to be a very split opinion out there on this. So like I said, overall, I think it's a really good album. I just don't revisit it all that much anymore. Let me know what you think. Okay, coming in at number 8 on my Lizzy list, I have the last of the Eric Bell studio albums. Yep, it's their third album from 1973. I'm talking about Vagabonds of the Western World. Now, this was a really tough one for me to figure out where I was going to place it, because I'll tell you this, out of the Eric Bell albums, this is by far my favorite one. It's got some great songs on there. The title track, of course, The Rocker, is an absolute stone cold classic Lizzy song. The Hero and the Madman and A Song for While I'm Away are really cool songs. This is a great album. It's got some excellent playing on there, and you could really tell that by this point, Lizzy was starting to up their game a little bit more. Like, Phil was getting a little more confident as a player and as a front person, and you can hear it on this record. It's really good. Now, here's the ironic thing about Vagabonds. I think that Lizzy was great at this period, but when it comes to the original album and the original track listing of the album, some of the best songs that they had from back during that time are not on this album. Because of course their big breakthrough hit at that time was Whiskey in the Jar, which was a single. Cruising in the Lizzy Mobile is a really cool song, but that was a B-side. Little Darlin' is a great Thin Lizzy song. Again, not on the original pressing, at least not the one that I have. So it's weird, like this period had some really excellent stuff with Eric Bell with the trio version of Thin Lizzy, but it's not on the original version of this album. So yeah, the re-release of this album in this period really benefits from the really strong singles that they put out. And that's why this goes up a little higher for me, and maybe some days it could go even higher than that. But being honest with myself, I feel like this sits pretty solidly at number 8 for me. All right, we're at number 7 on my Lizzy list, and this might surprise some people that I ranked this higher than some of the other ones on the list, but yeah, I'm going with 1981's Renegade. Telling you the honest truth, this was an album that as a kid, I was not all that familiar with when I was first a big Lizzy fan. It was kind of hard to find there for a little while. I don't know if it went out of print for a little while or it was just limited, because I don't think it was a super successful album, at least not here in the United States. But at one point, a good friend of mine who was really into Lizzy told me, like, dude, you have to listen to Renegade. It's much better than people give it credit for. And I did, and I'm really glad he suggested it to me, because as much as I do like Chinatown, out of the Snowy White albums, I think Renegade is a much stronger album overall. Angel of Death is fantastic. The song Hollywood is a total Lizzy classic in my book. The title track, Mexican Blood, It's Getting Dangerous. I think there's a lot of really, really strong music on this album. Now, the one thing I will say about these 80s albums is that it is evident that Phil was starting to struggle with his own personal problems and addictions, and it did affect his performance even in the studio, but I don't think it takes away from the overall performance and drama that's presented on albums like Renegade. This is a really good album, folks. I mean, again, I know this is another one where a lot of you are kind of dismissive towards it. A lot of people don't like that early 80s Lizzy stuff. Go back, have an open mind, and listen to Renegade and give it more of a chance, because this is a really, really cool album, and it is one that, especially when I'm in the right mood, I love playing this one from beginning to end. In fact, I think this album needs to be played from beginning to end. I think it works better as a complete whole than being an album where it's got a bunch of individual songs that maybe you'll go back and visit, like some of the other more well-known Lizzy albums. This one I really like to take in as a whole, and as such, it ranks number 7 for me. Okay, coming in at number 6. This is going to be a little bit contentious, because this is one of those albums that, again, it's another love it or hate it for a lot of Lizzy fans. But the people who love it really, really love it. And I have a feeling there's some people that are going to be mad that this didn't rank higher. But for me, my number 6 is 1983's Thunder and Lightning. Yeah, now, admittedly, right now this album is ranking pretty high for me because we just recently lost guitarist John Sykes. I think he was one of the greatest guitar players of the 80s and beyond. Doesn't get the credit that he deserves. He's always been one of my favorites. His playing on this album is ferocious, man. Let me tell you. Many of you might be more familiar with him from his Whitesnake work and Blue Murder. If you're not that familiar with what he did on this album, man, go back and give it a chance. This is a ripping album. But I do admit, it is a little different for Lizzy. This is pretty much like a true metal album, or at least it's more of a true new wave of British heavy metal album. This definitely fell in with what was going on in the UK at the time with metal bands. This could sit right up there with bands like Diamond Head and Judas Priest and Saxon. It's not to every Lizzy fan's liking. I understand that. Some people feel like it's too metallic. Some of the stuff is too fast. There are times where I admit, especially when you watch live clips from this era, that Phil, especially due to his age and his health and stuff at the time, he was struggling a little bit with some of this material. But it doesn't take away from just how great this album is. When you're in the mood for some more heavy, metallic style Thin Lizzy, this album is killer. So many great songs on this album. The title track, one of my favorites, just ripping. The Sun Goes Down, Holy War. Of course, probably the most well-known song on this album at this point is the first song on side 2, which was Cold Sweat. Heart Attack, even Baby Please Don't Go. Man, this is a really, really great album. And again, when I'm in the mood for more ripping, heavy, just that Sykes vibe, you know, because Sykes had that certain kind of style and approach to his playing. It's great hearing my man Scott Gorham, you know, try to keep up with him and everything, like, and he does an incredible job. I really love this album. This is definitely my favorite of the 80s albums, but I do acknowledge that it's not for every Lizzy fan out there. If you're a fan of the stuff they did back in 1975, 1976, you're not necessarily gonna jive with this album. So I get it. I'd love to know where this album ranks with you. Is this like a top 3 for you, or is this lower down on the list? It was really hard for me to figure out where to put this, but I feel pretty good about putting it at number 6, man. The other 5 are just, they're so incredible. They had to edge out this one, but yeah, this is a super solid number 6 for me. Thunder and Lightning. All right, we're in the top 5 now of my Lizzy studio albums list. And coming in at number 5, oh man, some people are going to be upset about this because I know a few people in particular who consider this to be the best Thin Lizzy album. And yeah, I just don't agree, even though I think it's a wonderful album. I'm talking about 1976's Johnny the Fox. Now look, don't get me wrong, Johnny the Fox is a great album. It's got incredible playing on it. I mean, Brian Robertson is probably like at the peak of his playing prowess on this album. And there are songs that are incredible. Johnny is great. Don't Believe a Word, of course. Fool's Gold. Johnny the Fox Meets Jimmy the Weed is a slinky song. And of course, Massacre, which just has incredible guitar playing on it. It's a truly great album, but if I can use kind of an analogy that hopefully won't get lost on everybody out there, but for those that are familiar with old Queen, if you're an old Queen fan, I always felt like Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox were very similar to Queen's A Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races. Now, I don't mean similar in that they sound alike, because the two bands sounded completely different from one another, but I mean similar in the way they sort of fit together, each album fits together. Whereas Jailbreak for me is obviously the more like prime album, the one where they were just firing on all cylinders. And they are on Johnny the Fox as well, but it feels like part 2. Feels like a really, really awesome sequel, if that makes any sense. It's a great album. I do listen to this album quite a bit. The songs that I love on here, especially stuff like Fool's Gold, Don't Believe a Word, Massacre, those are great, great songs, but I don't find myself listening to them as much as the other 4 that are above it. This is a killer album. And like I said, I know people that just adore this album, think it's the best thing they ever did. I can't really argue it. I get it. I completely see why they might feel that way. I just don't feel like this album has quite enough of the stone cold killer Lizzy classics to rank higher than these other 4 albums that are coming up next. So yep, number 5 for me is Johnny the Fox. We're at number 4, and let me just say that these top 4 are all almost equally beloved by me. It's just super hard figuring out how I was going to rank these. I had to really, really be honest with myself about them in order to put them in this order, and I'll explain to you as I go. Number 4 for me is 1975's Fighting album. So this is the moment when I feel like Lizzy really started to become Thin Lizzy, the Thin Lizzy that most of us know. Brian and Scott truly started to find their voice collectively together as a guitar duo. You have incredible guitar work on tracks on here like on Suicide, Wild One, King's Vengeance, which is one of my favorite songs of all time. Of course, the title track and then their cover of Bob Seger's Rosalie are just classics as well. Absolutely love this album. There are some days when this is like my favorite Thin Lizzy album. So why are you saying this is number 4? Well, again, I had to be honest with myself, and I was like, how often do you sit there and listen to this album from beginning to end uninterrupted compared to the other ones? And when I sat there and I really thought about it and I listened to it again, I realized that even though I do listen to the whole album sometimes, I find myself sometimes starting to tap out about 75% of the way through the album when I listen to it. Side 1 is incredible. Side 2 starts with, again, one of my favorites, King's Vengeance, but then it starts to slide a little bit. And I'm not saying that the other songs on side 2 are not good songs. They're very good songs, but I don't always hang in there for the finished, complete ride. And so as such, that was the way I had to figure out where I was putting this, because like I said, there are times when I tell people like, oh yeah, Fighting is like my favorite Thin Lizzy album or in my top 2 or something. But when I sat there and I really was honest with myself, I just couldn't put it up that high. It has to sit at number 4 because it's only occasionally that I listen to this from beginning to end, even though it has a couple of my absolute favorite Lizzy songs on there. As a whole album, and because this is the way I chose to rank these, this one is at number 4. All right, coming in at number 3 on my Lizzy list. I'm going to sound like a broken record at this point because I'm going to tell you honestly, this album, my God, do I love this album so much. And again, it's another one that depending on the day or the week, I might say this is my favorite Thin Lizzy album. I do listen to this one all the way through many, many times in the past, and I will in the future. I'm talking about Bad Reputation. I mean, honestly, for me, this album is pretty much flawless. I don't have any criticisms I could say of this album other than, yes, I do wish that they had been a more solid 4-piece at this point. When they were going in to make the album, Brian Robertson had exited the band. He did this a couple of times. He was not there for the entire production of the album. He does appear on the album on a few tracks, but by and large, most of the guitar work and the writing is done solely by Scott and, with Phil, of course. Now, I am a dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore Scott Gorham fanboy. He's one of my favorite guitar players of all time. I think he's just a legend, and I think he did a fantastic job on this album, even mostly all by his lonesome. So I'm not taking anything away from him, but I do wonder what this album could have sounded like had they had the core 4 from the previous few albums on this album as a whole. Would it have made it better? It might have. As it stands, I love the album. Soldier of Fortune, Opium Trail, Southbound, the title track, Dear Lord is an underrated, just heart-wrenching classic from this band. Of course, the big single was Dancing in the Moonlight. I think that's a really nice song. A couple of deeper tracks on side 2 that I really, really love, Downtown Sundown and That Woman's Gonna Break Your Heart. Oh, man. This is so hard. As I'm talking about it, I love this album so much. But again, I just had to look at it like, how often do you play this album all the way through compared to the others? And being honest with myself, number 1 and number 2 on this list, I play all the way through more frequently and, more completely than this one. But man, that being said, Bad Reputation is just one of the all-time greatest rock albums ever made. It's just that they also happen to have 2 more of those on this list ahead of it. All right, so we are down to that pivotal last 2 here that I keep talking about. What comes in at number 2 and what's number 1? Well, here you go. My number 2 Thin Lizzy album that I spin the most and that is very near and dear to my heart, it is 1979's Black Rose, a rock legend. So at this point in the band's history, Brian Robertson left. He was out. There was no coming back for him. He did make some brief special guest appearances later, but as a proper full-fledged member of the band, he was done. But what we do get with this album, finally, is we get a proper Thin Lizzy album with Gary Moore on lead guitar. And wow, what an album, especially, man, if you're a guitar, I'm a guitar player. So if you're a guitar player, wow, this album is fantastic. The playing of Gary Moore and Scott Gorham on this album is, it's just in the stratosphere for me. The album starts with Do Anything You Want to Do, which is, again, that's probably in my top 10 favorite Lizzy songs of all time. Toughest Street in Town is a rockin', just aggressive, catchy as hell song, and possibly my favorite Thin Lizzy song of all time. That's a tough one to really gauge, but possibly, again, some days it's my favorite, would be Waiting for an Alibi. Got to Give It Up is a great song. Of course, Sarah, not the same Sarah that was on Shades of a Blue Orphanage, but the new Sarah that he had written for his young daughter. That's a beautiful song. I love the video for it. If you go on YouTube and you watch the video for Sarah, it's great. The ending makes me laugh every time I see it. And of course, what ends up being like the big album epic ending track, which is basically like the title track. That song, wow, what a song that is. Just, I don't even know what to say about it. You have to hear it. You have to hear all the movements it goes through. Again, the guitar playing goes from aggressive to beautiful to being so lyrical, and this album is just something else. And I gotta tell you, I feel like for as much of a guitar player's album as it is, I also feel like Phil was really firing on all cylinders when it came to his lyric writing on this album. Some people I've seen, complaining about it, saying some of the lyrics are a little corny. I don't buy that shit at all. I think the lyrics on this album are fantastic. But also, this is a really catchy album. I feel like the songs on this album get stuck in my head. Every time I listen to it, they get so stuck in my head. They were at their most, not poppy, it's not a poppy album, but there was just something about the hooks, lyrically, melodically, even the drum beats that Brian Downey was doing on this album. There was just something about where they were at this time that it's astonishing that this album wasn't a complete and utter breakthrough for them, especially here in the United States, because a lot of these songs should have been FM radio staples, but it just never really worked out that way for Thin Lizzy, other than in one or two cases a few years before this. Anyway, Black Rose, wow, just, it's a great album. As much as I absolutely love Bad Reputation, this album is just so amazing from beginning to end, and because it represents such a brief, bright spot in Thin Lizzy's catalog with Gary Moore fully fledged in the band, yeah, it had to sit really high on my list. It didn't make number one, obviously, but man, it's right up there. All right, and we have reached the top. We are at the number one spot on my Lizzy list, and of course, if you've been paying attention and keeping score, you know what the number one album is. Yeah, some people might say it's obvious. Some people might argue with me about it, but it's my list. It's my personal opinion and how these albums matter to me. And number one, of course, is 1976's Jailbreak. Now, obviously, this was the big international breakthrough album for them. This is when that core lineup of the band with Brian Downey, Brian Robertson, and Scott Gorham, along with Phil, really just found it, man. Like, they figured out how to just make it all work, and everything from the songwriting, the playing, the production, the whole theme. It's not a concept album, but the whole theme they went with, even with the artwork and some of the lyrical stuff going on inside, they just figured it out perfectly. It's such a great album. This was the album that I first really fell in love with Thin Lizzy when I was a kid. I liked them. Of course, I'd heard Boys Are Back in Town 5 million times on the radio, and I do love that song. I legitimately do. I'm not sick of it. I know other people are sick of it. I still love hearing it. But it wasn't even that song that really made me love this album. It was a lot of the deeper album tracks on here that I think are fantastic. Angel from the Coast. That is such an underrated, top of the heap rock, heavy rock, early proto metal, whatever you want to call it. Just a great rock and roll song. The guitar playing on that song is stellar. I love the tempo of it. Just so great. The whole first side of this album, the sequencing is genius. You've got the title track. I mean, Jailbreak, come on. Like, just one of the greatest 70s rock songs ever made. Angel from the Coast, Running Back. I feel like, I know Brian Robertson bagged on Running Back. He said he didn't think that was a great song. I think it's a beautiful song. Lyrically, it's one of my favorite songs that Phil ever composed. And then on that same note, Romeo and the Lonely Girl. Oh, that's an underrated song too, man. That's such a great one. And then for the people that really love like the more aggressive guitar stuff, you've got Warriors, you've got Emerald. I mean, to me, again, as a guitar player, I feel like Emerald is probably in the top 5 of one of the greatest like guitar duo songs ever created. It's flawless. There's nothing wrong with it. It's got Cowboy Song on this album, which is another, look, man, I know that it might seem like Jailbreak is like the safe and easy answer and people are going to dismiss it. To me, it's just one of those albums. It is up there with Sgt. Pepper's and A Night at the Opera and Destroyer and Ziggy Stardust and so many of the other albums that I feel are just untouchable. Jailbreak to me is untouchable. Now, again, like I said, some days of the week, some months, some weeks, whatever way the wind's blowing, I might sit there and say Black Rose is my favorite Lizzy album. I might sit there and say Bad Reputation is my favorite. Even Fightin' is one of my favorites, you know. But when I'm truly honest with myself, Jailbreak is the #1 Thin Lizzy album for me because it's one that it's the first album I ever listened to from beginning to end by them, and yet 40 years later, I can still listen to that album from beginning to end, and I don't need to skip any tracks. I don't lose interest. I love it from beginning to end. Jailbreak is a wonderful album, and that's why it is my #1 Thin Lizzy studio album. And there you have it. I know a lot of you, I already know a lot of you are going to really argue with me about some of my placement here. Again, let me just reiterate, like I said at the beginning, I love all these albums. I really do. There's not one of these that I'm saying is a bad album or is inferior in some major way. Some I just like more than others. And in some cases, it's just a matter of some I play from beginning to end more frequently than other albums. Even though, again, some of these albums might on some days be more of a personal favorite, or some albums have songs that I like better. It's a really tough thing to do. I'm sure you all go through it too, and you know what it's like trying to rank these things, especially when a band like this and their catalog is so near and dear to you, like Thin Lizzy is to me. But again, thank you for joining me here. Let me know in the comments, what did you think of my list? And especially, you know, let me know your list. I want to know why you rank certain albums higher than others. Is it simply because you like it more? Or are you like me and it's just like, oh, I find myself revisiting certain ones more and spinning them more? Tell me, because, you know, it's fun to talk about this stuff. It's all done in fun, and, you know, it's not, no need to get mean, no need to get angry about it. We're just having fun talking about some good old rock and roll that helped shape our lives when we were growing up. So hit the subscribe button, hit the like if you enjoyed this, share this with your other friends, especially if you've got other Lizzy fanatics like us. I'd love to hear from them too. I'm going to be back soon. I've got way more album ranking stuff coming up. I've got more Kiss content like I talked about. I've got Black Sabbath stuff coming up. I've got Queen. I'm going to just be focusing on the bands that for me are my all-time favorite bands. I'm not interested in ripping on anybody or talking shit. I just want to embrace these bands' catalogs that I love so much and made me who I am, and share it with you and talk about it and debate about it a little bit with all of you. So until next time, enjoy your records and have a good time. Talk to you soon. Bye.